darkness had been my loyal companion from my very first breath. I was born into a world where colors didn't exist, where shapes were mere abstractions, and beauty was perceived through touch and sound. Doctors explained to my parents that a rare genetic anomaly had deprived me of sight even in the womb. My retinas were like blank canvases never graced by images of the outside world. But I didn't know what loss meant, for I had never possessed what I was deprived of. My childhood passed in a small house on the outskirts of the city, where every creak of the floorboards, every scent and every touch became part of my inner map of reality. My mother, a kind woman with a soft voice and gentle hands, patiently taught me to navigate space. She guided my fingers over objects, explaining their purpose, shape, and texture. My father, a man of few words but boundless love, read me books every evening, his deep bass filling the room with astonishing stories of worlds I could only imagine. Years of schooling at a special school for blind children became a time of discovery for me. I mastered Braille with such ease that teachers called me a prodigy. My fingers glided over the raised dots with a speed that amazed even experienced instructors. Literature became my passion, music an escape, and mathematics a way to structure the chaos of sensations into logical schemes. But the most important thing I gained in those years was the understanding that my world was not worse than the sighted world. It was simply different. Nevertheless, my parents never gave up hope. They secretly saved money, consulted various specialists, and studied the latest treatment methods. Every month, my mother cut the family budget, denying herself even the essentials. My father worked overtime, sometimes 12 hours a day, to save funds for a possible operation. They believed that science was constantly advancing and that someday a way would be found to give me sight. When I turned 25, an event occurred that changed everything. Dr. Carlson, a renowned ophthalmologist from a capital clinic, introduced a revolutionary technology: the implantation of an artificial retina. It was an experimental procedure that could restore sight to people with congenital defects of the visual apparatus. The cost of the operation was astronomical, but my parents had long been preparing for this moment. I remember the day they told me about the possibility of the operation. My mother cried with joy, and my father, usually reserved, couldn't hide the excitement in his voice. I sat in my favorite armchair, running my fingers over the pages of a book, and felt their hope fill the room. But inside me there was no such enthusiasm. I had grown accustomed to my world, learned to live in it, to love, to create. The thought that everything could drastically change frightened me more than it thrilled me. Weeks of preparation for the operation passed in endless medical examinations. Dr. Carlson, a middle-aged man with a confident voice and a firm handshake, explained each stage of the procedure to me. He spoke of how tiny electrodes would be implanted into my damaged retina, how they would stimulate the optic nerves, sending signals to the brain. Theoretically, this should allow me to see basic shapes and contours, to distinguish light from dark. The night before the operation, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the hospital room listening to the sounds of the night city outside the window, and contemplated how my life would change. What if I saw the world entirely different from how I had imagined it? What if reality turned out to be cruel and disappointing? These thoughts whirled in my head until morning arrived. The operation lasted 7 hours. I was under general anesthesia, but even in an unconscious state, I felt something fundamentally changing in my head. When I woke up, my eyes were bandaged, and Dr. Carlson said the bandages would be removed in a week. That week became the longest of my life. I lay in darkness more absolute than what I was accustomed to and waited. My parents kept vigil by my bedside day and night. My mother read me books. My father told me the news, but I heard tension and worry in their voices. They feared the operation might not succeed, that I would remain blind, but now with additional problems. Dr. Carlson visited every day, checking my condition, but was a man of few words. He said everything was going according to plan, but I detected a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Finally, the day of the bandage removal arrived. Dr. Carlson entered the room accompanied by several nurses. My parents stood beside my bed, and I felt their hands trembling with anticipation. Slowly, layer by layer, the doctor removed the bandages. At first, I felt no difference, but then something changed. Initially, it was like a faint glow, as if someone had lit a distant candle in absolute darkness. Then the glow became brighter, and I began to distinguish vague outlines. Dr. Carlson held a bright flashlight in front of my eyes, and I saw it as a blurry white spot. It was incredible. For the first time in my life, I perceived light not as warmth on my skin, but as a visual image. The following days were a period of gradual adaptation to the new sensation. My vision returned slowly, like a photograph developing in a dark room. At first, I could only distinguish the contours of large objects. Then I began to see people's faces as blurry patches. Dr. Carlson explained that my brain was learning to interpret new signals, that it was a normal adaptation process. But even in the first few days, I noticed something strange. Sometimes, when I looked at the walls of the room, it seemed as if dark shadows were crawling across them. The doctor said these were normal hallucinations that occur during the visual system's adaptation. He assured me they would pass with time, and I believed him. How wrong I was. A week after the operation, I was discharged home. My first steps in the familiar house were a true revelation. I saw walls that I had once only explored by touch, furniture that I knew by heart but had never seen. My mother cried with happiness watching me examine the familiar objects. My father stood silently nearby, but I saw endless joy and pride in his eyes. They were convinced they had given me a new life. The first few days at home were like a celebration. My vision continued to improve daily. The picture became clearer. I could distinguish colors, though not very vividly. Red seemed like a dark gray with a hint of warmth. Blue, cold and deep. The green color of the leaves outside the window was calming, though I couldn't understand why this particular shade had such a soothing effect on me. The world turned out to be much richer than I had imagined in my dreams. However, the strange shadows did not disappear. Moreover, they began to appear more frequently. At first, I only noticed them in my peripheral vision, dark silhouettes rapidly gliding across walls or flickering in the corners of rooms. When I turned my head to look directly, there was no one there. I decided that this was indeed a feature of my brain's adaptation to new signals and tried to ignore them. But with each passing day, the shadows became more distinct. Sometimes it seemed as if they had a will of their own, that they were watching me. I particularly noticed them in the evening when the lamps were lit in the house. Then the shadows became denser, as if feeding on the contrast between light and darkness. They seemed to come alive, taking on almost human outlines, yet retaining something deeply inhuman in their movements. A month after the operation, I saw my mother's face for the first time. It was an amazing moment. Finally, I could connect the familiar voice with a visual image. She was a beautiful middle-aged woman with kind eyes and wrinkles from frequent smiles. But as I looked at her, sometimes it seemed as if a dark figure stood behind her shoulder, almost touching her. Yet she didn't notice it. The figure was tall, with unnaturally long limbs, and seemed to study me with cold curiosity. I decided not to tell my parents about my visions. They were so happy about my recovery, so proud of the operation's outcome, that I didn't want to overshadow their joy. Besides, I still hoped it was a temporary phenomenon related to adaptation. Dr. Carlson, during his last visit to the clinic, confirmed that my vision was recovering better than expected. The implants worked perfectly, and from a medical point of view, I was an exemplary patient. But in reality, everything was far from perfect. The dark entities I could now see became increasingly active. They were no longer limited to my peripheral vision. Sometimes I saw them directly in front of me, standing in doorways or sitting in the corners of rooms. They appeared translucent as if woven from dense darkness, yet they possessed enough density to cast their own shadows. Most of all, their interest in me frightened me. Wherever I went, whatever I did, I felt their presence. They didn't bother me or cause physical pain, but their very existence near me created an atmosphere of constant tension. Sometimes it seemed as if they were trying to communicate with me, tilting their heads, gesturing, but I couldn't understand their intentions. They became especially active at night. When I went to bed, I saw their silhouettes gathering around my bed. They stood motionless like guardians watching me sleep. At first, this caused me panic, but over time I grew accustomed to their presence. They did nothing threatening, they just observed. Sometimes it even seemed that they were protecting me, though from what I didn't understand. 2 months after the operation, an event occurred that changed my perception of what was happening. I was walking in a park near my house, enjoying the ability to see trees, flowers, and the interplay of light and shadow. My vision had become sharp enough to distinguish details, and for the first time in my life, I could truly observe the world around me. But when I sat down on a bench to rest, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In front of one of the trees stood a man in a dark suit. He was completely real, not translucent like my usual visions. A middle-aged man with a pleasant face and a friendly smile. He was feeding pigeons, and the scene looked perfectly normal. But what I saw around him made me doubt my own sanity. The same dark entities that had been following me swirled around the man, but there were many more of them. They literally swarmed him, touching his clothes, face, hair. And the most terrifying thing was, they seemed to feed on him, becoming denser, more real. The man stood in the midst of this nightmare and smiled, unaware of what was happening around him. Moreover, he looked morbidly pale, tired, as if something was draining his life force. I realized that these creatures were not just observing. They were parasitizing people, feeding on their energy. And now that I could see them, I understood that the world was full of these invisible predators. This incident made me look at my visions in a new light. I began to observe people more carefully and realized that dark entities were present next to every person. Some had more, some less, but no one was completely free from their presence. They were especially active around people in states of stress, illness, or depression. It seemed that negative emotions attracted them like light attracts moths. I began to study the behavior of these creatures, trying to understand the patterns of their actions. They were not chaotic. There was a certain system in their movements, as if they obeyed some laws unknown to me. Some of them seemed more intelligent than others. I was particularly interested in those that followed me. They were larger than the rest, more clearly defined, and there was a sense of purpose in their behavior. The most terrifying discovery was that these creatures reacted to my attention. When I looked directly at them, they turned towards me as if sensing my gaze. Some of them even approached, studying me with curiosity. I realized that I had become something special to them, the only person who could see them. This thought gave me no peace. Why me? Was it related to the operation, to the implants, or was the reason something else? Perhaps the ability to see these creatures was not a side effect of the treatment, but the price that had to be paid for sight? Or had they always been there and I simply couldn't see them before? Attempts to find answers in medical literature and on the internet led nowhere. No one described such visions after sight restoration surgeries. All sources spoke of possible hallucinations during the adaptation period. But this was something completely different. My visions were too constant, too logical to be explained by simple neurological disorders. Gradually, I began to understand that I was living in two worlds simultaneously. One was the ordinary world that everyone sees, a world of colors, shapes, and light. The other was a gloomy parallel world inhabited by dark entities that exist beside us but remain invisible to most, and I was the only person who could see both worlds at once. This realization radically changed my perception of reality. Every day became a struggle with my own fears and doubts. I felt lonely, isolated from the rest of the world. My parents rejoiced at my recovery. Friends congratulated me on the successful operation. But no one could understand the nightmare that had become my daily reality. It was especially hard to realize that these creatures were attracted not only to negative emotions. The more I observed, the clearer I understood that they fed on any strong emotion. Fear, anger, joy, love. They were like energy vampires, draining people of everything precious. And now that I knew of their existence, I saw how they were slowly but steadily depleting the human race. 3 months had passed since the operation, and my vision had reached an almost perfect level. I could read small print, distinguish details at long distances, and enjoy the beauty of nature and art. But this joy was poisoned by the constant presence of the dark entities. They had become such a commonplace part of my life that I had learned to ignore them, just as people ignore the background noise of a city. However, ignoring them became increasingly difficult. The creatures that followed me began to show more and more activity. They seemed to be studying me, trying to understand how I could see them. Sometimes they approached so close that I felt a coldness emanating from their spectral bodies. This cold was not physical. It penetrated deeper into the very soul, making me feel emptiness and despair. Most of all, I was concerned that they were beginning to influence my behavior. Not directly, not forcing me into any actions, but creating an atmosphere of constant tension and anxiety. I became more irritable, less patient. Sleep became restless and disturbed. My appetite virtually disappeared. My parents began to notice these changes and worry about my condition. My mother often asked if I was okay. She saw how pale I was, how my hands trembled, how I flinched at sudden sounds. My father suggested seeing a doctor, undergoing additional examinations. But how could I explain the truth to them? That their son, whom they loved so dearly, who had received the long-awaited gift of sight, now saw nightmares that haunted every person? I tried to find any information about such phenomena in books on psychology, parapsychology, even religious texts. I studied descriptions of various visions, hallucinations, and mystical experiences. But nowhere did I find anything that even remotely corresponded to my experience. All descriptions were too general, too symbolic to explain the specificity and constancy of my visions. The only thing I found were mentions of people who, after injuries or surgeries, began to see what was hidden from others. But these mentions were scattered, often contradictory, and most authors regarded them as manifestations of mental disorders. Perhaps that was indeed the case. Perhaps my ability to see dark entities was a form of schizophrenia or another mental illness. But if these were hallucinations, why were they so consistent? Why did the entities always appear in specific places, behave logically and predictably? Why did their behavior correlate so precisely with the emotional state of the people around them? Hallucinations are typically chaotic and unpredictable. My visions were entirely different. 4 months after the operation, an event occurred that finally convinced me of the reality of what I was seeing. I was returning home late in the evening after a visit to Dr. Carlson. The autumn rain had turned the streets into mirrors, reflecting neon signs and streetlights. I walked along a deserted street, enjoying the interplay of light and shadow, when I noticed a woman standing on a bridge over the river. She was young, about 25, with long dark hair and a sorrowful face. Even from a distance, I could see tears on her cheeks. But the most terrifying thing was that dozens of dark entities swarmed around her. They were larger and denser than those I had seen before, almost material. They surrounded the woman in a tight circle, as if pushing her towards the edge of the bridge. I realized she was about to jump. The despair emanating from her was so intense that the dark entities literally feasted, feeding on her emotions. The more she suffered, the more active they became. It was a vicious circle. Her suffering attracted them, and their presence amplified her despair. Without thinking, I ran to the bridge. The woman was already lifting her leg, preparing to climb over the railing. I shouted, begging her to stop, not to do it. She turned to me and I saw such pain in her eyes that my heart clenched. But the most amazing thing was that as I approached, the dark entities began to retreat. They didn't disappear completely but became less active, less aggressive. I spent several hours with this woman just talking to her. She told me about her problems, losing her job, breaking up with her beloved, her mother's illness, ordinary human woes that had driven her to the brink. And as we spoke, I saw the dark entities gradually retreat, their grip on her weakening. When she finally agreed to come down from the bridge, I realized that something important had happened. My ability to see these creatures was not just a curse. It could also be a gift. Perhaps I could help people, protect them from unseen predators. This thought gave me a new purpose, a new meaning to existence. I began actively seeking out people who were in a state of severe emotional distress. It wasn't difficult. The dark entities always pointed them out to me. They swarmed around depressed teenagers, lonely elderly people, those experiencing loss. I approached these individuals, spoke to them, tried to offer support, and each time I saw how my presence made the entities retreat. At first, I thought it was due to my special vision. Perhaps these creatures feared someone who could see them. But gradually I understood that it wasn't just that. When I genuinely empathized with people, when I tried to help them, the dark entities weakened. Positive emotions, compassion, love, hope, were like poison to them. This discovery changed my life. I stopped perceiving my ability as a curse and began to see it as an opportunity to help people. I became a volunteer in various charitable organizations working with people in crisis situations. My past blindness helped me understand the suffering of others, and my newly acquired sight allowed me to see humanity's invisible enemies. But the more I helped people, the more aggressive the creatures that followed me became. They seemed to understand that I was hindering their feeding and began to take more active measures. The cold emanating from them intensified. Sometimes I felt them trying to penetrate my consciousness, to influence my thoughts and emotions. They began to show me visions, nightmarish pictures of suffering, death, despair. These visions were so realistic that sometimes I couldn't distinguish them from reality. I saw the people I had helped die terrible deaths, my parents suffering from incurable diseases, the world plunging into chaos and destruction. Gradually, I realized this was their revenge for my interference. They couldn't cause me physical harm, but they could attack my psyche. Every day became a struggle not only with visible problems, but also with invisible enemies who tried to break my will and force me to abandon helping people. Sleep became almost impossible. As soon as I closed my eyes, the nightmares began. I saw myself in endless corridors filled with dark entities. They pursued me, surrounded me, tried to engulf me. I woke up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, and realized that this wasn't just a hallucination. It was a real attack on my consciousness. My parents became seriously worried about my condition. I had lost a lot of weight, become pale and exhausted. My mother insisted on seeing a doctor, but I knew no one could help me. How could I explain to a doctor that the cause of my problems was invisible creatures waging war on me? Dr. Carlson, whom I eventually saw, conducted a full examination. The implants worked perfectly, my vision was normal, and no medical problems were found. He suggested I had depression or an anxiety disorder related to adapting to a new reality. He prescribed antidepressants and suggested seeing a psychologist, but the medications didn't help. If anything changed, it only got worse. The dark entities became more active, as if the drugs somehow amplified their influence on me. I realized that fighting them required not chemical means, but strength of will and spirit. I began to study various practices of meditation, self-hypnosis, and spiritual development. I tried to find ways to protect my consciousness from the invasion of dark entities. Some techniques indeed helped. Deep meditation created a kind of shield around me that the entities could not overcome. But this shield required constant concentration, and I couldn't maintain it around the clock. Gradually, I realized I was trapped. The more I helped people, the more aggressive the entities became. But if I stopped helping, I saw them literally devouring suffering people. It was unbearable to know that you could help, but every act of help brought you closer to your own destruction. About 6 months after the operation, I noticed that the dark entities began to change. Those that followed me grew larger and denser. They acquired clearer outlines, becoming almost material. Sometimes it seemed as if they could influence the physical world, move objects, create cold drafts, affect electronic devices. The most terrifying thing was that they began to communicate with me. Not with words, but with images, emotions, thoughts that suddenly appeared in my consciousness. They showed me the history of humanity from their perspective, an endless chain of suffering, wars, catastrophes. They claimed to be a natural part of the universe, that without them humans could not evolve, that suffering was necessary for the growth of the human spirit. There was a twisted logic in their message. They were not evil in its pure form. They were a force that compelled people to develop through overcoming difficulties. But the price of this development seemed too high to me. I saw them draining life from people, turning them into empty shells. 7 months after the operation, an event occurred that changed everything definitively. I was walking down the street as usual, observing people and the dark entities around them, when I noticed a child. A boy of about 7 was playing in a sandbox, his mother sitting on a nearby bench. The scene was idyllic, but what I saw made me stop. There was not a single dark entity around the child. He was surrounded by something that could be called light, though it wasn't ordinary light. It was an aura of purity, of innocence that repelled the dark entities. They kept their distance from him as if they couldn't approach, but the most amazing thing was that the boy noticed me and approached. He looked into my eyes and said in a very serious voice, "Uncle, why are you so sad? Why are there so many dark shadows around you?" I froze. This child saw the same thing I did. But unlike me, he wasn't afraid of the dark entities. Moreover, his presence made them retreat. I realized I had met someone who could help me understand the nature of my gift and find a way to cope with it. The boy, named Danila, turned out to be an amazing child. He was born with developmental peculiarities that doctors couldn't explain. His mother told me that from early childhood he spoke of dark people he saw everywhere. Psychologists considered it a manifestation of childish fantasy or a consequence of his peculiarities, but now I understood that the boy possessed the same gift as I did. Danila became my guide into a world I was only beginning to understand. He explained to me that dark entities had always been a part of the human world, but most people couldn't see them. They fed on human emotions, especially negative ones, and the more suffering a person experienced, the stronger these parasites became. But the most important thing Danila told me was that there was a way to resist them. Pure emotions, love, compassion, joy unmixed with selfishness, were detrimental to them. That's why there were fewer dark entities around children, especially young ones. Childhood innocence and purity created a natural barrier against them. For the next few months, I spent time studying this invisible war between light and darkness. Danila taught me to see not only the dark entities, but also their opposite, luminous entities that protected people. These beings were less noticeable, almost transparent, but they were present near people who lived in harmony with themselves and the world around them. I understood that the world was in a constant balance between these forces. Dark entities sought to plunge humanity into suffering and despair, feeding on negative emotions. Luminous entities tried to inspire people to good deeds, love, and compassion. And people unknowingly were the battlefield between these opposing forces. My ability to see both sides of this war made me special. I could choose which side to support, which forces to strengthen with my actions. When I helped people, the luminous entities grew stronger and the dark entities retreated. But when I succumbed to despair or anger, the opposite happened. Danila warned me that the dark entities didn't choose me as their target for no reason. People who could see the invisible world posed a special threat to them. If such a person chose the side of light, they could change the balance of power on a local scale. Therefore, they tried with all their might to sway me to darkness or destroy me. This information explained a lot. The constant attacks on my consciousness, the nightmares, the visions, all of it was an attempt to break my will and force me to stop helping people. They wanted me to either join them or go insane from the constant pressure, but knowledge gave me strength. Now I understood what I was fighting against, and this understanding allowed me to develop a defense strategy. I became more cautious, learned to recognize their attacks and resist them. The meditation I had studied earlier turned out to be an effective weapon against their influence. However, with each passing day, the struggle became harder. The dark entities, realizing they couldn't break me with ordinary methods, began to employ more sophisticated tactics. They started to affect the people around me, especially my parents. My mother began to suffer from inexplicable bouts of depression. The woman who had been an optimist her whole life suddenly became gloomy and subdued. She cried for no reason, complained that life had lost its meaning. I saw the dark entities surrounding her, feeding on her suffering, and understood that it was my fault. My father became irritable and aggressive. The man who had never raised his voice began to yell at the slightest provocation. He started drinking, which was completely out of character for him. The dark entities provoked him into fits of anger, and then fed on those emotions. I understood what was happening, but I couldn't stop it. Any attempt to help my parents only intensified the attacks on them. The dark entities used my love for them as a weapon against me. They showed me that the price of my struggle was the suffering of my closest loved ones. Danila tried to help me protect my parents, but his strength wasn't enough. He was still a child, and his abilities were just developing. Moreover, his mother, frightened by my death, became even more insistent on psychiatric treatment for her son. Isolation increased the pressure from the dark entities. They surrounded me in a dense ring, and there were more of them every day. I woke up and saw their faces distorted by malice and hunger. They followed me on the street, in the store, at home. There was no place where I could feel safe. Gradually, I began to realize that I was losing this war. My strength was depleting, and theirs only grew. Every person I helped attracted the attention of new dark entities. They seemed to be summoning their brethren to fight the threat I posed. 8 months after the operation, an event occurred that became a turning point. I was walking down the street late in the evening when I saw a group of teenagers gathered in an alley. Many dark entities swarmed around them, and I realized they were planning something terrible. The dark entities were pushing them towards violence, feeding on their aggression and desire for destruction. I tried to intervene to talk to the teenagers, to distract them from what they were about to do. But the dark entities proved stronger. They directed all their malice at me, and the teenagers unknowingly attacked me. I sustained serious injuries and ended up in the hospital. Lying in the hospital room, I realized I had reached my limit. My body was exhausted, my psyche on the verge of collapse. My parents sat by my bedside, and I saw their suffering. My mother had aged 10 years in those months. My father looked like a broken man. The dark entities were literally devouring our family. It was then that I made a decision that changed everything. I understood that I couldn't win this war, but I could change its outcome. If I didn't resist, if I allowed the dark entities to take what they wanted, perhaps they would leave other people alone. Dr. Carlson visited me in the hospital. He was concerned about my condition and suggested additional tests. Perhaps the implants were somehow affecting my psyche. He hinted at the possibility of removing them if it would help solve the problem. But I knew it wasn't about the implants. They only gave me the ability to see what had always been there. Removing the implants would return me to blindness, but it wouldn't free me from the knowledge of the dark entity's existence. I would know they were there, but I wouldn't be able to oppose them. Discharged from the hospital, I began to prepare for the final battle. I understood that this would be a fight to the death. Either I would find a way to defeat the dark entities or they would destroy me. There could be no compromise. I studied all available sources of information about similar phenomena. I contacted various religious figures, esotericists, and paranormal investigators. Most of them thought I was crazy, but some took my stories seriously. One old priest told me about ancient practices of exorcism. He didn't claim that the dark entities I saw were demons in the classical sense, but he believed that the principles of fighting them might be similar. He taught me prayers and rituals that were supposed to protect against dark forces. A parapsychologist I met offered a different approach. He believed that dark entities were manifestations of the collective unconscious, archetypes that fed on negative emotions. He suggested trying energy work techniques, visualization of protective barriers, but all these methods only provided temporary relief. The dark entities adapted to my defensive techniques, finding new ways to attack. They were much older and more experienced than I in this war. The decisive event occurred 9 months after the operation. I was walking down the street late in the evening when I saw a group of teenagers gathered in an alley. Many dark entities swarmed around them, and I realized they were planning something terrible. The dark entities were pushing them towards violence, feeding on their aggression and lust for destruction. I tried to intervene, to talk to the teenagers, to divert them from what they were about to do. But the dark entities proved stronger. They directed all their malice at me, and the teenagers unknowingly attacked me. I sustained serious injuries and ended up in the hospital. Lying in the hospital room, I realized I had reached my limit. My body was exhausted, my psyche on the verge of collapse. My parents sat by my bedside, and I saw their suffering. My mother had aged 10 years in those months. My father looked like a broken man. The dark entities were literally devouring our family. It was then that I made a decision that changed everything. I understood that I couldn't win this war, but I could change its outcome. If I didn't resist, if I allowed the dark entities to take what they wanted, perhaps they would leave other people alone. Dr. Carlson visited me in the hospital. He was concerned about my condition and suggested additional tests. Perhaps the implants were somehow affecting my psyche. He hinted at the possibility of removing them if it would help solve the problem, but I knew it wasn't about the implants. They only gave me the ability to see what had always been there. Removing the implants would return me to blindness, but it wouldn't free me from the knowledge of the dark entity's existence. I would know they were there, but I wouldn't be able to oppose them. Discharged from the hospital, I began to prepare for the final battle. I understood that this would be a fight to the death. Either I would find a way to defeat the dark entities or they would destroy me. There could be no compromise. I studied all available sources of information about similar phenomena. I contacted various religious figures, esotericists, and paranormal investigators. Most of them thought I was crazy, but some took my stories seriously. One old priest told me about ancient practices of exorcism. He didn't claim that the dark entities I saw were demons in the classical sense, but he believed that the principles of fighting them might be similar. He taught me prayers and rituals that were supposed to protect against dark forces. A parapsychologist I met offered a different approach. He believed that dark entities were manifestations of the collective unconscious, archetypes that fed on negative emotions. He suggested trying energy work techniques, visualization of protective barriers, but all these methods only provided temporary relief. The dark entities adapted to my defensive techniques, finding new ways to attack. They were much older and more experienced than I in this war. The decisive event occurred 9 months after the operation. I was sitting at home, trying to meditate, when I heard screams from the street. Rushing out of the house, I saw a terrible scene. The house across the street, where a family with small children lived, was on fire. The firefighters hadn't arrived yet, and people were in a panic. I saw dark entities swarming around the burning house. They fed on people's fear, their despair, their pain. But the most terrifying thing was that they were hindering the rescue efforts. They influenced people, prevented them from coordinating actions, amplified the panic. Without hesitation, I rushed to help. Using my knowledge of the dark entity's behavior, I was able to organize people, direct their actions. My ability to see invisible enemies allowed me to resist their influence. We managed to save everyone from the burning house, but this victory came at a great cost. The dark entities understood that I would never give up, that I would fight them to the end. They decided to destroy me at any cost. That night, they launched their final attack. I woke up to a feeling of absolute cold. The room was filled with dark entities. There were so many of them that I could barely make out the walls. They surrounded my bed in a dense ring, and their malice was almost tangible. But this wasn't an ordinary attack. They weren't trying to influence my consciousness or show me nightmares. They simply stood and watched me. There was something final, resolute in their postures. They had come not to frighten me, but to take me. I understood that this was the end. All my attempts to fight them had been doomed from the start. They were too strong, too numerous. A human cannot win a war against forces that have existed since the beginning of time. But even at this moment, I felt no regret. I had helped many people, protected them from invisible predators. Perhaps my sacrifice was not in vain. Perhaps someone else would continue this fight. The dark entities began to approach. The cold became unbearable. I felt my strength leaving me, my consciousness beginning to fade. They weren't killing me physically. They were draining the very essence of my existence, my soul. At the last moment, I saw light. Not ordinary light, but the radiance that emanated from the luminous entities. They had come to protect me, but it was too late. There were too many dark entities. The battle between light and darkness unfolded right in my room, and I was its epicenter. I saw the forces of light and darkness fighting for my soul. It was majestic and terrifying at the same time. Energies that usually remained invisible manifested in all their power. My room became a battlefield between good and evil, but the outcome was predetermined. The dark entities had been preparing for this moment for too long. They had made sacrifices, accumulated strength, gathered an army. The luminous entities could not withstand such power. Gradually, I felt my connection to the physical world weaken. My body grew colder, my breathing shallower. I understood that I was dying, but strangely, it didn't frighten me. I had fulfilled my duty, done everything I could. The last thing I saw were the faces of my parents. They had entered the room, awakened by the noise of a battle they couldn't see. My mother screamed, seeing my condition. My father rushed to the phone to call an ambulance, but I knew that doctors couldn't help me. My illness was not of a physical nature. The dark entities retreated, leaving me to die. They got what they wanted. They eliminated the threat I posed. Now they could continue their work, feeding on human suffering undisturbed. My parents never truly understood what had happened to me. They blamed themselves for not being able to help me, for not understanding the seriousness of my problems. My mother couldn't forgive herself for not insisting on more intensive treatment. My father withdrew into himself, becoming even more reclusive. But the most terrifying thing was that my death did not stop the dark entities. They continued their work, feeding on human suffering. Without my resistance, they became even more active in our area. The levels of depression, suicides, and violence significantly increased. Danila, the only person who understood the truth about my death, tried to continue my work. But he was still a child, and his capabilities were limited. Moreover, his mother, frightened by my death, became even more insistent on psychiatric treatment for her son. Dr. Carlson conducted research into my case. He tried to understand what led to such a tragic outcome. The implants were extracted and thoroughly examined, but no anomalies were found. Articles appeared in medical journals about rare side effects of sight restoration surgeries. But the true cause of my problems remained unknown. Now, as I exist in that space between worlds, I understand the full tragedy of the situation. My gift of sight was not a blessing, but a curse. I saw what should have remained hidden, learned a truth that proved too heavy for one person. The dark entities continue their work. They feed on human suffering, intensify negative emotions, and push people towards destruction. And the luminous entities try to resist them, but their powers are limited. The balance in the world is disturbed, and darkness is slowly winning. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had remained blind. Perhaps I would have lived an ordinary life, unaware of the invisible war. Perhaps I would have been happy in my ignorance. But then the people I helped would have been defenseless against the dark forces. There is no right answer to the question of whether I should have gained my sight. Every choice has its price. I paid for my gift with my life, but perhaps this sacrifice was not in vain. Perhaps someone else will continue the fight against the dark entities. My last lesson to humanity: be careful what you wish for. Sometimes the fulfillment of desires turns out to be a curse. The world is full of secrets that are better left undisturbed. Some truths are too terrifying for the human mind, but if you do encounter the invisible world, remember, light exists even in the deepest darkness. Love, compassion, hope, these are weapons against dark forces. Use them wisely, and perhaps you can shift the balance towards light. My story ended tragically, but the struggle continues. Within every human being lies the ability to choose between light and darkness. Make the right choice before it's too late.